Hello, everyone. It is 7 o'clock, so we are going to get going. So I want to welcome you guys to the first webinar of the 2023-24 BCRC webinar series, where we will be discussing drought and how to keep today's drought from becoming tomorrow's problem. I'm Sydney Fortier. I'm a Research and Innovation Coordinator for the BCRC, and I will be your moderator this evening. We are very excited to be able to put on these webinars for free, thanks to the Knowledge Dissemination and Technology Transfer Project, funded by the Canadian Beef Cattle Checkoff and Canada's Beef Science Cluster. This webinar will be available for CE credits for veterinarians and vet techs across Canada. If you have identified yourself as a vet professional during the registration process, you should automatically receive your certificates within a week. We actually now have multiple webinars available for CE credits. You can find those on our website, which will require you to take a quiz, get 80% or more, and then you will receive your certificate that way. If you're having any difficulties whatsoever in terms of receiving your certificates, please feel free to reach out to myself or our other staff member, Dana Parker. I will have her email posted briefly up on the screen as we go through these slides. As we are kicking off our presentations, if you have any questions that come up, we ask that you submit those through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will have that Q&A session at the end of the webinars once we've heard from both of our speakers, and then address those live. We ask that you don't use the chat function to ask your questions, as they can kind of get lost and messy, but feel free to chat with other participants through the chat function as we go through our presentations in the Q&A as well. This webinar is being recorded, and those recording will be sent to all those who have registered, not just those who are attending live today, within 2 to 3 business days of the live webinar. You can also find recordings of all of our past webinars and other great videos on our website, beefresearch.ca, or our YouTube channel. So be sure to subscribe while you are there as well. So as I mentioned, this is how you would contact Dana Parker, and here's just a little bit of the selection of webinars that we have available for CE credits. And of course, if you would like any more information, please reach out to myself or Dana as well. So before we get started, I just wanted to call your attention to a great resource that we have available on beefresearch.ca, which are these easy to read fact sheets of all of our ongoing and completed projects. We have also just started sharing some of our hot off the press results as they come in the form of our roughly quarterly results are in posts. So you can find the fact sheets on our website under the producers tab, and then clicking on research summaries and fact sheets, which will allow you to see a whole alphabetized list with the ability to filter by keyword, date range, and topics. And they cover everything from new ways to combat biofilms at the processing plants, to using water bowls to monitor BRD pathogens, evaluating the value of wheat and feedlot diets, and all the way to advancing genetic improvement on farm, and so much more. So we really encourage you guys to take a look there and see all of the cool stuff that we have currently being funded, and some stuff that we've done in the past. But without further ado, we have 2 very exciting speakers for you this evening who are raring to share their thoughts and answer your questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite John to share his. We will hear from Jessie a little bit later on, and then we will follow up her presentation with the Q&A session. So our first presenter is Dr. John Campbell. Dr. John Campbell graduated from the Ontario Veterinary College, or the OVC, in 1985. After several years of private practice, he returned to the OVC to complete a doctorate in veterinary science. He has been part of the Western College of Veterinary Medicine's ruminant field service practice for more than 25 years now, and is the director of the college's disease investigation unit. He is also the head of the WCVM Department of Large Animal Clinical Sciences. His main research interests are the epidemiology of infectious diseases and beef cattle health and management. Recent projects include being a primary investigator of the Canadian Cow-Calf Surveillance Network and hosting the Beef Cattle Health and Nutrition podcast. And for those of you who have not listened to the podcast before, I highly encourage you to. It's a great listen. I'll drop that link in the chat. So I'm going to pass it over to you, John.
Thank you, Sydney. That's an old bio. I'm not the department head anymore, so I'm just a normal everyday faculty member anymore. So I think you got one from a few years ago, but that's fine. I'm here to talk about the sort of longer term animal health implications of drought. And I got to say, it's not my favorite topic. It's one of those things where we have very little control over how much rainfall we get, and we're often placed in some pretty tough situations, have to make some pretty tough decisions when it does affect us. And it is pretty severe. This is the drought monitor data as of September 30th of this year. And 72% of Canada is classified as either abnormally dry or moderate to exceptional drought. And you can see there's a lot of cattle located where those darker areas are impacting a lot of Canada. So I want to talk about a number of things that we may have to deal with as a result of drought that might not show up right away. Obviously, there's lots of things that we deal with drought, and many of you are familiar with that, especially in the last few years. But I want to talk about vitamin A, vitamin E deficiency, nitrate toxicity, and copper deficiency, some of the winter feed issues that we might see when we're feeding unusual feeds. And then finally, just very quickly, I want to talk about body condition and reproductive effects. So I want to start with vitamin A. It's probably one of the things that is linked to drought, maybe the strongest of all the things I'm going to talk about. Vitamin A is a fat-soluble vitamin. It's found in fresh green forage largely. It's beta carotene. That's the precursor that has the greatest vitamin A activity. So that's the orange yellow pigments that we get in green leaves. And so cattle eat that, and it's stored in the liver and fatty tissues. And the liver contains about 90% of the vitamin A. So if they stop eating green feed, they're going to have maybe about 4 months of storage if they've had lots of green, fresh forage. But obviously, the risk factors are when pastures get bleached out, or we have drought-grown hay that we're feeding, weathered forages, prolonged feed storage, all the things that happen to us during drought conditions. The signs that we see with vitamin A are pretty variable. We can see stuff from stillborn weak calves, poor conception rates, immune deficiencies, and even blindness and neurological signs. I'll show you some videos of some of those in just a few minutes. We've done a bit of work out of the WCVM here over the last few years, and Dr. Waldner's done some really neat stuff on the impacts of low vitamin A on calf crops. She and Dr. Fabian Eulinger published a paper in 2017 where they looked at calves from 150 herds in Alberta and Saskatchewan and got vitamin A levels from them. And almost 60% of the calves were classified as less than adequate. Vitamin A deficiency in those calves was associated with drought conditions. So if you had less than 200 millimeters of rain on your farm, you were more likely to have vitamin A deficiency in your calves. It's important to note that vitamin A doesn't cross the placenta. So the newborn calves get all their vitamin A from the colostrum. So when people send me a newborn calf sample to get vitamin A levels at it, I never know if it's the cow that was low in vitamin A and so she didn't get much to the calf, or maybe the calf just didn't get colostrum. So you've always got to differentiate those two things. But the big part of that study, calves with low serum vitamin A, if they were less than sort of the deficient level, they were almost 3 times more likely to die. So pretty significantly associated with health as well. Another study that Dr. Waldner did where she looked at stillbirth risk across a number of herds in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, showed that the risk of stillbirth was significantly increased in low precipitation years. Now, she was controlling for all the other factors. So that's controlling for body condition score and all the other things that might impact risk of stillbirth. So low precipitation still had an impact, and that's probably through vitamin A, although it could be through some other factors as well. So this is a video of a calf born on a ranch in Saskatchewan that probably has vitamin A deficiency. I got another picture of another calf from the same ranch brought into the clinic, and you can see it's got obvious neurological signs. These calves were completely blind. They probably had increased brain pressure as well. And when we got the ophthalmologist to look at their eyes, or we looked at them at postmortem, they had severe eye abnormalities, retinal detachment, etc. So this probably happened in early gestation. This cow herd, it was a pretty significant drought area where these calves came from a few years ago. They ran out of grass midsummer. The cows were in good shape. The owner had supplemented them even on pasture, but there was no vitamin A available, and we had these calves born with these multiple eye problems and nervous symptoms. The second vitamin deficiency I want to talk about is vitamin E, and it's maybe not quite as strongly associated with drought, but it's still a fresh green forage sort of source. It's another fat soluble vitamin, and stored feeds just don't contain much vitamin E. So if we have to feed our cattle stored feeds for a longer period of time, as we often do in drought, we probably have a little higher risk of vitamin E deficiency. The signs that we see are pretty similar to selenium deficiency. The two are linked pretty strongly. So we'll see things like white muscle disease. We'll see impaired immune function. Again, dead, weak calves. Sometimes we'll see an increase in retained placentas in cows that are calving and reduced fertility and growth rates. Again, out of that same study that Dr. Waldner and Dr. Ulinger did and published in 2017, they looked at vitamin E as well. And they noticed that vitamin E was lowest in very young calves. Again, it's transmitted through the colostrum to the calf. So maybe that's not surprising. Calves born later in the calving season. Calves born to heifers, again, may not get quite as good a colostrum from those heifers, and calves that didn't receive selenium or vitamin E injections at birth. And if the calves had less than adequate vitamin E, they were about 3 times more likely to be treated for scours, which shows you sort of the relationship with immunity and resistance to disease. Well, if that's not enough, we have other things to worry about with drought conditions, and probably a fairly major one is nitrate toxicity. So this is going to show up in when we start feeding these cattle annual plants, often either through swath grazing or through green feed or things like that. And usually it's drought stressed annual crops. There's also a few weeds that accumulate nitrates as well. And kochia is one of those weeds that sometimes gets used as feed for cows. So it's another one to think about. Nitrate's interesting because it's managed by the rumen bacteria mostly. So the rumen bacteria, we have trillions of rumen bugs inside that rumen of the cow, and they convert nitrates to nitrites and then to ammonia, and that ammonia is absorbed into the blood and excreted in urine. However, if they get overwhelmed and can't keep up, and there's too many nitrates in the feed, then those bacteria can't convert enough to ammonia, and those nitrates start to accumulate in the blood, and they cause toxicity. And what happens is those nitrates change hemoglobin into methemoglobin. That's in the red blood cells, and methemoglobin can't carry oxygen. So these animals basically die of tissue suffocation or lack of oxygen. They have lots of red blood cells, but they can't carry any oxygen in their red blood cells. So it's a pretty rapid disease when it kills animals, but we do see some subclinical signs as well. So often the report is sudden death. These cattle go into respiratory distress. They have difficulty walking. They go down. They die fairly quickly. If you do a postmortem, they'll have this chocolate brown colored blood because there's no oxygen in that blood. They may have blue-gray mucous membranes because they've suffocated basically. But there are several reports that say, hey, if they're lower levels, it reduces productivity, or it may even cause abortions and stillbirths. And I'm not sure I've seen abortions and stillbirths that I could attribute to nitrates, but that might be another one of those reasons that in those low rainfall years, we see more likelihood to see stillbirths like Dr. Waldner saw in that study. So we can test for nitrates, and this is a year where you got to do some feed testing. You got to make tough decisions about things. And one of the things will be to do is to make sure to test for nitrates. The nice thing is that we can adapt cattle to fairly high levels of nitrates if we do it gradually. We can also dilute the nitrate content by adding combinations of low and high nitrate feeds, allow those cattle to adjust to low levels before we increase the nitrate content, and then make sure we're feeding a balanced ration for the level of production we're expecting, etc. I'm going to put a quick plug on copper deficiency. Again, this is not a major drought issue, but I think it probably is associated with drought to some extent. And I think it's one of the biggest problems we have in Canada. It's by far and away the most common trace mineral deficiency of beef cows in Canada from some of the work we've done. We can see copper deficiency in two ways. Firstly, primary copper deficiency, where the cows just don't get adequate levels of copper. We see that lots of times. We can also see secondary copper deficiency where there's copper, but it's being bound up in the rumen by other minerals. And the big ones that we worry about are sulfates, molybdenum, and iron. So I'm kind of hypothesizing, and I don't think we know this for sure, but maybe secondary copper deficiency gets worse slightly in drought conditions. First of all, if we're using surface water for grazing in the summer, the sulfate levels can go up. We've seen catastrophes with that in the past and problems with that. And that's a common issue in Saskatchewan and parts of Alberta. Also, high sulfate feeds become a bit more common in drought conditions where we're feeding things like canola forages and kochia. So you have to think about the sulfates that are both in the feed and the water that could be binding that copper up in the rumen. I think the biggest thing that I've seen in a number of investigations I've done is impaired reproductive performance. We see really, really low pregnancy rates in some of these herds. And when we go and look for reasons why, lots of times we'll find very, very, very low copper levels in some of those cows. We'll see some other signs. Sometimes you can see loss of color, bleaching of the hair coat. If it's younger animals, they may not do very well, stunted growth, low weaning weights. It's often associated with other problems because it doesn't impair the immune response, and especially things like parasites, coccidiosis, roundworms, etc. If I see a coccidia outbreak in calves where I don't think it should be happening, they've got fairly good management otherwise, I often wonder if the copper is low in those kind of herds. And even lameness can happen in more severe cases. This is a bit of a busy slide, but it's data that we've collected through our cow-calf surveillance network over the last 10 years, basically. In 2014, we sampled cows in just Western Canada. In 2016 and in 19, we sampled cows in 2016 was Western provinces as well, and in 2019 was all across Canada. If you just look at the bottom half of that graph, that's copper deficiency. You can see in 2014, we sampled about 2,000 cows. Almost 43% of them were deficient. These are in well-managed herds that are doing most things correctly, and we got 43% of the cows deficient in copper. It was a little lower in 16 and 19, about 25 and 29%, but it's still very significant. There's no other trace mineral deficiency that we have anywhere close to that. And you can see that almost 80 to 90% of cows are deficient in Western Canada. 80 to 90% of herds have at least one cow deficient in Western Canada. Eastern provinces, it was a little bit lower, but it's still a major issue there. This is just a graphical representation of that. Again, there's lots of blank areas in northern parts of Canada where we didn't sample cows, but you can see there's pretty significant dark areas there in North Edmonton, around Saskatoon, Regina, southern Alberta as well, and even out in the Maritimes and places where the deficiencies are higher. So it's something to be aware of. I'm not sure it's the hugely stronger issue with drought, but it's certainly something that we're seeing everywhere. And I think if your sulfate levels are up because you're feeding higher sulfate feeds, you might make that worse. Really quickly, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but lots of producers become a little more reliant on straw-based rations or alternative kind of forage rations that may have higher levels of NDF, higher fiber levels that can't be digested as well by the cows. And a common problem that we'll see when the weather gets cold is rumen impactions in those herds that are overly reliant on straw. Some straws like flax straw are really, really high in NDF, and you just can't feed very much of it, even though it has energy, it has some protein in it and stuff, but there's just too much fiber in it that the cow can't eat enough and get that through their system. So the rule of thumb is about 1.5% NDF as a percentage of body weight. Another reason to feed test is to figure that out ahead of time, so you know. Sort of Sask Ag sort of suggests a maximum of 10 pounds per head per day of high NDF feed, such as flax straw. A couple winters ago, dealt with a herd investigation where cows were going down with impaction, well-managed herd. Again, they were just trying to push flax straw as one of the feeds really, really heavily, trying to feed 20 or 30 pounds of it to these cows. They were trying to eat a lot because it was cold and they were hungry, but it just binds them up, and we start seeing rumen impactions. The last thing I want to end on is body condition and postpartum intervals. And I show this slide in lots of different talks. I show it to my students, and it's an old slide from a research project done years ago. Basically, they took cows in 3 different body conditions: thin in the blue line, moderate in the yellow line, and good condition in the red line. And they charted when they came into heat after they calved. So you can see that when about 40 days after calving, there's 25-30% of the cows start cycling even 40 days after calving. They probably didn't read the textbook, those cows, but it's amazing that some of them start cycling, and even some of the thin cows are cycling by then. But let's go out to about 70 days after calving. You can see that the good body condition cows, almost all of them are cycling by there. The moderate condition cows, only about 80% of them are cycling, and the thin cows, just over half of them are cycling at that stage. So you can see that those thin cows, they take longer to start cycling on average after calving. And so as a result, I think some of the reproductive effects of poor body condition score can occur kind of gradually and kind of creep up on us. And I think anecdotally, I've had a few veterinarians tell me that this year we're starting to see some really low pregnancy rates in some of their herds as they're doing preg checking. And I think that's this gradual buildup that we've had a number of years of low water conditions and probably cows that are getting in poor body condition. So here's an ideal calving distribution. You got 65% of the cows calving in the first 21 days, 20% calving in the next 21 days, and another 10%. And there's only about 5% of the cows open. So let's say we started at that, but then, it was a tough year. The cows were a little thinner than they should have been. They dropped a bit of body condition. Well, the next year, it may not be that bad, right? They start slipping down that thing because they end up calving a little bit later the next year. And there's a few less cows in that first 21-day window. Now it's only 50%. And there's a few more down in these 2 windows. And now there's a few more open, but it's not bad. And if you're just looking at your pregnancy rates, you go, oh gosh, we're okay. It's only like 7% open. That's still pretty good. But then the 3rd year, if we get another year like that, it just starts getting worse and worse. And now we got 20% open. And I think anecdotally, we're maybe starting to see that a little bit this year, where in some of our areas, we've had 2 or 3 years of pretty tough weather. And it's been impacting those cows. And now it's starting to really affect the pregnancy rates in those herds. So what can we do? I think I got 5 or 6 things here. There's no easy answers to drought, and I don't want to minimize the challenges that ranchers face when they do that. But one of the things is to feed test, feed test, feed test. It's probably, we talk about feed testing all the time. It becomes even more important in drought years. We're feeding unusual feeds. We're feeding things we don't usually feed. We've got nitrates to worry about. We've got lots of other things to worry about. You got to plan ahead. You got to figure out, okay, how many cows can I feed this year with the feed I have, etc. And that requires doing some feed testing, doing some ration balancing, working with a nutritionist or a veterinarian that can help you do that, and planning ahead. We got to maintain body condition to avoid those reproductive wrecks. And, that may mean making some difficult decisions about how many cows to keep and things like that. Again, no easy decisions, sourcing different feeds, et cetera. But that just ties into the feed testing. Without those feed tests, we can't sort of make those decisions. The big one I want to promote is monitoring vitamin and mineral levels in your cows. It's really not that hard to do. Your veterinarian can help you do that. I would suggest sampling a small group of cows in the fall of the year when you start feeding them, to see sort of where you're at and how they did over the pasture season. You can do liver biopsies. You can take some blood samples. We can look at vitamin A levels. We can look at trace minerals like copper, et cetera. And then once you get them on your mineral program and vitamin program, whatever that may be, you may want to reassess that sometime prior to calving to make sure that things are working right, that you've got them where they should be, that they're eating enough mineral, that you don't have interactions that are hurting the copper levels or something like that. This may be a year when we have drought that you might consider using injectable vitamin A products. We can feed vitamin A. It works fine if we can get it into the cows, but there are times where that may be difficult. I think in a lot of our extended grazing systems, we rely on free choice trace minerals a lot more, and we have that longer period where we're just relying on cows to eat mineral on their own, and they don't always do it. So injectable vitamin A products might be necessary in some of those situations. And then you might want to think about alternatives to sort of free choice mineral supplementation as well. So it's always better to force feed it if we can. That's not always possible depending on the management situation. We now have some injectable trace minerals available that are licensed in Canada now, which might be an alternative and something to talk to your veterinarian about as an option. So I think that's it from me, Sydney. I'll turn it back to you and to Jesse.
Great. Thank you so much, John. That was so great. I think every time I had a question, you were able to answer it right in the next slide. But I'll remind the group that if there are any questions that have come up, please feel free to throw them in the Q&A and continue to do so as we introduce our next speaker. So next up, we have Jessie Williams. Jessie Williams ranches with her husband and 2 children in the special areas of Alberta. They have a cow-calf operation and offer a selection of Sim Angus bred heifers annually. She was a former Canadian Cattle Young Leader, mentee, and a former director of the Alberta Beef Producers Board. When she is not on the farm, she is managing the Agricultural Services Program in her municipality as a professional biologist. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to you, Jessie.
All right, let's see if I can remember how I'm sharing my screen here. All right. Share screen. Let's try that. Oh, share. How's that? Am I cooking? Not quite.
We can see it. We're seeing your notes still, though.
Oh gosh, and we practiced this. Let me try one more time here. There we go. How about that? Maybe.
Sorry, I lost my mute button there. It looks great.
Okay, good. All right. Thank you so much for having me. And thanks to BCRC for coordinating these webinars, and to John and BCRC for all their resources. I use them almost daily, so I really appreciate it. And I think we're pretty lucky in the Canadian beef industry to have you guys. So let's see if I can find my mouse here. I'm going to try and focus on kind of what we do on our farm to get through some drought, and hopefully there's some nuggets in there that everybody can use. So welcome to my dry corner of the world. I think I was that little dark red blotch John had on his map. We're in the Palliser Triangle here. So that's an area that explorer John Palliser described as arid desert and uninhabitable when he found it in the 1800s. And the municipality of special areas that I work and live in was actually the result of widespread drought in the 1930s and poor soil conservation practices that basically the inhabitants up and abandoned their lands. And now we have the special areas. So I included a little chart here of the precipitation, annual precipitation of my township over the last almost 100 years that we have on record. On the far left, you can see 1949, it was our driest. And then on the far right, you can see 2023. We're giving 1949 a run for its money. We do have a few months of snow accumulation that could, bring us back up, but it wasn't a fun year. Of the worst 10 droughts in history for my township, I have been lucky enough to be ranching through 4 of them in the last 10 years. And we received, I think, 3 inches on our farm during the growing season last year, this past year. So this is kind of my outline. It's kind of just a formula of getting through the drought and hopefully being in good shape when it breaks. Obviously, there's not lots of negative implications of a drought, but there is actually some positive ones that I'm going to go through as well. So first thing you're going to want to do in a drought, or I think you should do, is cull. Cut the low-hanging fruit from your operation. You can do this by destocking different groups. If you've got yearlings, get rid of those first. In case of a cow-calf operation, remove the cows that are costing you money. If you remove the underperformers, you're going to improve your herd genetics and be in a more profitable stance to build a higher performing herd when the drought does break. So first thing I would encourage you to do is look at your records. If you don't have records, maybe this would be a great time to start keeping records. And on our farm, firstly, we preg check. If she's open, she's gone. Not only is that an income loss because she's not going to have a calf, the cost to feed her, why is she open? That could be a health or disease potential risk. And just like John said, she's not going to catch up if she's late. So you may want to look at getting rid of your lates as well, or at least charting those over time. We then call any cow that had a calving complication. We calve in March. We've got 2 little kids. We don't have time for calving complications. So if she, had an issue last year that was, her fault, she's gone. Plus, why did she have calving complications? This leads to body condition scoring, just like John said. The biggest expense on a cow-calf operation is feed. Maintaining a skinny cow is expensive. Not only that, she'll be less likely to come into heat in the first cycle, like John said, and the risk of calving complications that I don't have time for actually doubles, according to some stats on BCRC website. Then, of course, if she does get pregnant, her colostrum's probably going to be poor quality, like John said, have a less healthy calf, wean a smaller calf, and then you're going to have that wider range of calf sizes, which is going to be less marketable. So if you have the opportunity to get your individual weaning weights, I would suggest it. We call based on individual weaning weights annually. Just pick, X% of the dams with the lowest weaning weights automatically leave our herd. And just by doing this alone, we've increased our average weaning weight since 2016, 100 pounds. So that's a lot of money in our pocket. And again, it makes that range of calves much tighter and much more marketable for a buyer. Kind of off topic, but something we've learned is if you have performance data on your cattle through your records, and you can prove it, you can ask buyers for better prices. You don't have to be a price taker in this industry, contrary to what a lot of people believe. So create a marketable package with data to back it up, and you're going to have a lot more flexibility in your marketing strategies, which can also help you through a drought. If you can calculate your weaning weight as a function of your cow's weight, do that. If she's a big cow but produces an average calf, is she worth keeping and feeding? While this is number 5 on the slide here, I can tell you that sometimes it's number 1 in my heart. If a cow poses a safety risk to me or my family, she's gone. Consider taking this opportunity to cull those wild cows. Life's too short for a wild cow, in my opinion. Now's the time to get rid of her. We also obviously cull cows with poor quality udders and feet and soundness issues. But if she's an underperformer, or sorry, if she has those qualities, she's probably an underperformer and she was gone in 1, 2, 3, or 4. But moral of the story is cull the cows that are costing you, because it's going to create a more profitable herd for you to build from in the future. Now that you've culled cows, look at your feeding strategies. And John did a great job of going over this, so I won't belabor it too much, but feed test everything. BCRC has acquired Cow Bites. It's a ration balancing software, and I cannot recommend it enough. We've used it for quite a few years. It's going to help you identify weak points in your feed. Like he said, if you have too much NDF, look at your TDN, look at your trace minerals, look at your vitamins, nitrate accumulations, mycotoxins, all those fun things. This is going to be incredibly important when you are using those alternative feeds and getting creative. What you feed your herd today will have an impact on your herd's performance and your bottom line tomorrow. And like John said, I would argue for years to come. One thing I did pop in here randomly, but if you're using salvaged crops as feed, make sure you are asking the farmer for their pesticide application records, just to make sure that you're meeting all the pre-harvest and grazing intervals. You don't want to put yourself in a funky situation there. Like John said, test your water, send it away. The BCRC website says that poor quality water can lead to a 30% increase in open cows. That's a big cost I'm not willing to incur. And on the flip side, calves with access to fresh pumped water average 18 pounds heavier at weaning. So that I'd be happy to have. On drought years, recently here, especially, we've seen a lot of blue-green algae, which is the top left picture, or cyanobacteria. It's a quick cattle killer. You don't want that. Like John said, look at your sulfur contents, I guess I would say. If you have too much sulfur, it can cause polio, like John said. You want to look at your nitrates, your salt content. There's can be some total dissolved solid issues in there. Look at your trace minerals. And like John said, you need to have the water and the feed and combine those values, and so you don't put your herd in a situation, a toxic situation. And then in the summer months, I mean, we're not just testing our water in the winter. In the summer months, make sure you're testing as well, especially when things change, like in a drought, because your cows are going to be consuming more water in, a 40-degree day, which we've had lots of in the past few years. So they're going to, if you have some sulfate or nitrate accumulation, it's going to be worse. Then I would say consider investing in off-site watering systems. It's going to keep your water sources clean. You're going to have less cattle drowning, through the dugouts in the winter. We see a lot of cattle getting stuck in mud, unfortunately. That's when the water is receded during droughts. And most importantly, you're going to protect your riparian areas. So your riparian areas are your drought mitigation strategy. They act as a sponge, they store water, and they release it when you need it. So you don't want to abuse them. Make sure you're not overgrazing them or letting cows in there during sensitive periods. A little word to the wise I've seen in my office lots. We have a lot of poisonous plants that like to live in riparian areas. They're usually not an issue for your herd because your cows don't graze there. But as the sloughs dry up, the only green forage available is in those riparian areas. Your cattle go in there, and now they're consuming poisonous plants that can kill your cattle pretty quickly. Okay, now I'm going to get on my egg fieldman soapbox for a moment. I can't stress the importance of knowing what you're bringing onto your land with imported feed. It's a necessary evil, but remember that whatever you put in your cow is going to come out the other end, and it's more than likely going to be ready to germinate. Even if you're in siling, it's not going to get hot enough, the weed seeds will persist. So make sure you have a weed management plan in place and you know what's in those bales. In my desk, I have seen imported feed infested with noxious weeds come at a huge cost to the producers. In the early 2000s, one of those little blips on the chart there was a pretty severe drought here. And people imported feed from the US and had knapweed in it, among other things. And to this day, you know, 23 years later, those producers are still struggling to contain those infestations. It's costing them huge. They're called invasive species for a reason. They're going to take over your productive species. And in a lot of situations, they're actually poisonous as well. Kochia, John talked about. It is not a regulated weed in Alberta. I know this is Canadian wide, but in Alberta it's not. But the bottom left picture there, you can see is an accumulation of kochia on a fence line. So we all know how fast it can tumble and spread. A single kochia plant can have 14,000 seeds in it. It's a C4 plant. It loves drought, it loves hot and dry. Luckily for us, if you're very creative and careful, you can feed it. It can actually be, you know, a really good feed source. I think I've read some stuff that says it can be nutritionally equal to alfalfa grass hay if you cut it at the right time. That comes with a lot of caveats that I won't get into, but if you're going to feed it, make sure you feed test it. You work with the nutritionist and you look at all the, you know, oxalate, sulfate, salt content situation. But just know that if you're going to feed it, you're going to have a weed management problem the following year. You need to make a weed management plan. The last thing on this topic that I will preach about from my soapbox is ditch hay. Super valuable resource, something that we rely on a lot in special areas, but just know your municipal and your provincial policies and bylaws on that. In Alberta, if the highway's numbered, it's an Alberta transportation you need to ask permission from. And this is most important because they're going to be informed by their egg fieldman if there is noxious weeds there, if there's prohibited noxious, if there's poisonous weeds, and if there was a recent pesticide application, what the cutting and harvesting restrictions are. So super important. I would recommend anytime you do ditch hay or anywhere like marginal lands, sloughs that you don't normally harvest, I would recommend walking them first. Know what your plants are, identify if there's any poisonous species or weeds. And especially in ditch hay, we see a lot of garbage, unfortunately. And if you shred that up or you roll it out in bales to your animals, we've seen a lot of animal health issues come that way. And then now, I think twice in my position at this desk, I have seen, unfortunately, someone unknowingly bale up a battery that was in the ditch. And one producer shredded it and fed it to his cows unknowingly, and one rolled it and the cattle licked it because it's got salt in it. And that causes lead poisoning, which is a reportable disease in Canada. Gets you a lovely visit from the chief provincial vet. You get a quarantine. There are food chain implications. So just make sure you know what you're feeding and walk wherever you're going to harvest that you don't normally harvest. If there's one thing about drought that is positive, if you can find one, it's that you will forever be more creative with your feeding strategy. Desperation breeds innovation. So I was lucky enough to be part of the Alberta Ranchers Winter Grazing Cattle YouTube video series quite a few years ago. There on the right-hand side. I would highly recommend looking it up. There's a bunch of series of short clips with tips and tricks taken from our area where producers are, you know, often in a drought and how they've survived and even thrived. So I'd highly recommend it. And then I just included there on the slide a few things that we've done in our operation to prolong feed costs. Again, kochia, be very careful with it. Hybrid fall rye, grazing salvage crops. This year we've tried lentils, grazing lentils for the first time and grazing corn. This is where I would say make those relationships with your neighbors, especially your cropping neighbors. You could graze headlands, stubble, their salvage crops. We have supplemented with pellets and grains. Pellets are a great way to get your mineral package into your animals, but beware, you need to make sure you feed test those again. That's often where you will see ergot and fusarium hiding, and you can't really see it until it's too late. Your animals are exhibiting symptoms, so make sure you're feed testing, just like John said. A few tips and tricks, things that can get you into trouble in a drought if you don't factor in is waste and weather. You need to make sure you're factoring those into your feed estimates for the winter now. You need to consider what your feeding system is and calculate a reasonable waste factor. There's a chart there in the bottom left of some of the estimates that have been done. We create our ration through cow bites, shred it into these bottomless bunks in the bottom right-hand corner, and we move those bunks once a week in the winter over our marginal croplands to distribute organic matter. But we do consider that a 10% loss in feed. So you need to make sure you have 10% extra feed in your feed stacks so you don't get in a situation. Factoring in enough feed for the changes in weather can also surprise you. So again, this magical cowboy software, $60, go get yourself one from the VCRC website. It is the spot where you can put in the temperature, the wind chill, the humidity, which is called the effective temperature, and that will help you calculate how much extra energy your cattle need just to maintain during those cold days. So if you forget to factor in these extras, you could run short on feed. So I would caution be extremely conservative with your winter feed needs and have more feed in the stack instead of trying to stretch what you do have to feed more cows, because you're going to see that body condition loss, which is going to have ripple effects through your herd. Lastly, on this slide, I would say you might want to look at feed efficiency opportunities. If they fit your operation, growth promotants, look at EPDs, your residual feed intake genetics, and make sure that you have your solid vaccination and herd health protocols up to date, because a healthy herd is a more efficient herd. Okay, I'm just about done, I promise, but this slide could probably be a whole presentation on its own if we wanted to look at soil health and plant communities and grazing principles. But from a very high level approach, you need to be managing your pastures for longevity. In my opinion, that's directly related to the species you have and the health of those species. So as you can see on this photo on the left, not my land, but one I did take, during prolonged drought, overgrazing happens. Even though most producers in our area know better, we've had so many droughts after drought after drought that their conservative grazing management practices hasn't been enough to cut it. So remember, the old adage is that for every day you graze too early in the spring, you lose 3 days in the fall. So for native perennials in our area, on a normal year, they would say don't graze until mid-June. If you had a drought and you overgraze, that might be, mid-July, or you might not even be able to graze that pasture at all and should rest it. So you need to account for this extra spring feeding now when you're calculating your feed, not in the springtime. Resist the urge to put those cows out as soon as you see green grass poking through the snow, because it will cost you. And use your rangelands to capture water. Water is often, a limiting resource around here, but litter is your best friend. So it will insulate the ground, allow for deeper, slower penetration when you do get a rainfall event. And on your native and tame pasture, as well as your cropland, make sure you leave enough litter or stubble to catch snow. We grew a 6-foot corn crop last year on snow. I can promise you it wasn't the 3 inches of rain we got over the growing season. It was snow. So make sure you're catching that snow. And so it's not just running off and you're losing that in the spring. There's really great resources out there to help assess your riparian area health and your rangeland health. BCRC has excellent resources. I would encourage you to use your local extension offices This is where I'm going to plug ours. Chinook Applied Research is amazing. Out here in the Oyen area, they've been helping producers through drought for 40 years. So even if you're not from here, I would highly suggest you look at their website and their resources because they've got some really good tips and tricks. All right, so to finish up, my key takeaways from operating in a prolonged drought, feels like forever, is to know your numbers on your cow performance, on your feed, on your pasture performance, your water inventories. You can't you can't manage what you don't measure. Like John said, feed and water test everything. Use a nutritionist if you need. Monitor your herd continually, especially over this winter. Look at their manure patties. That will tell you a lot about their nutrition. Read their bunks, look at their body condition scores so that you can make changes early, recognize those abnormalities as they're happening before you have a wreck. Make plans, make backup plans, and make backup plans for those because things are always changing in a drought. But you don't want to be making those plans, you know, when you're backed into a corner and you're panicked. Make plans now. Consult with your experts. Our industry is full of amazing resources, just like BCRC. Join a local industry group, a grazing group, get in touch with your extension offices, listen to John's podcast. I love it. Read all the BCRC articles you can. And I would encourage you to get out and network and build relationships within the industry. I know it sounds daunting, but from my experience, this industry is incredibly welcoming, always willing to mentor or give you tips and tricks. You just have to ask. So please do reach out. Of course, you know, look at your financials, use your financial experts. Ranching is a business. I know it's also a passion for most of us, but it is a business. There's lots of provincial funding opportunities usually available, especially when you're looking at water systems. Remember that it's not always about cutting costs during a drought. Well, that can help, but it's about making smart business decisions that will have impacts, positive impacts for years to come. So that may look like investing during a drought, which will hurt initially, but will have really positive impacts going forward. And so the very last thing I'll mention is that if I've learned anything through prolonged drought, it's that there is a cost to mental health and droughts. Drought is tough, really, really tough, especially prolonged drought. It all wears on us, even if you think it's not. So make sure you're looking out for your mental health resources, check in on your neighbors, look out for each other. Eventually the drought will end. I promise you. It doesn't feel like it, but eventually it will. So just look out for each other. And with that, I'm done. Thank you so much for having me. And if you want to connect with me, there you go.
Thank you so much, Jessie. I just want to make it clear that we did not bribe her to plug the BCRC resources.
You're just that good. I'm telling you, I use you all the time.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. But yeah, that concludes our speaking portion of the evening. And so we are going to open it up to the Q&A session. So Jessie and John, if you guys want to turn your cameras on, and I will start asking you guys some questions. We have about 10 minutes here. And so if you have a question and haven't asked it yet, feel free to throw it into the Q&A. And feel free to keep adding them as we go, and we'll just try to get to as many as possible. Okay. So the first questions that we have are surrounding some of the injectable vitamins that you mentioned, John. The first one is involving vitamin E. So if calves that are low on vitamin E are more likely to get scours, is a shot of Ceylon E, pardon me, at treatment for scours going to be helpful?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Probably would have been more helpful to give it to the cows before calving, or to give it the calf at birth. It's kind of like closing the door after the horse is out of the barn. If you're giving it to the calf once it has diarrhea. So I don't know. I mean, if the calf is deficient, it might help a little bit down the road. I'm not sure it's going to help with that immediately with that case of scour. So that's a good question. I think it would be ideal to make sure they're not deficient in the first place, though.
Thanks, John. The next question is surrounding the vitamin A. So, what would that specific injectable be called? And then some questions around whether it's fat soluble and if you can give it as a precaution. I guess you kind of addressed that with the vitamin A, but if you could, or vitamin E rather, but
well, yeah, vitamin A is different. So there's a lot of different. Most veterinarians will have a vitamin A, D, and E product on their shelves someplace for cows that you can get. That's an injectable product. It's a bit of a misnomer when it says A, D, and E, because most of those that don't have enough vitamin E to be useful at all. So it's really just vitamin A. The E is there just to preserve the product. So it's one of the products it's pretty tough to overdose cows with vitamin A. So you could probably give it precautionary without worrying about what their vitamin A levels were ahead of time. I think theoretically you can overdose vitamin A, but I think they've done work with cattle and multiple injections and never seen any downsides. You might be wasting your money and your time if you're giving it to cows that have adequate levels, I suppose. So you can give it as a precautionary thing. Usually what most people recommend is giving it in, a couple months before calving. Probably maybe you do it at a similar time when you'd give scours vaccines or something like that, so that the cows have high levels in the colostrum and the calves get those in late gestation. So yeah, it's fat soluble. You can give it an injectable. It's probably the one product where it's pretty tough to give too much. It is irritating. That's the reason we kind of moved away from injectables, and it kind of, it does, if you give it to baby calves, it's a kind of an irritating injection and can make them pretty sore and leave a long-term scar wherever it's given in some ways. So that's why we've tended to give it, try to feed it more than we can in other ways.
thanks, John. Just kind of a follow-up on that. Is it beneficial, or would you recommend testing to see if these cows are deficient in vitamin A first, whether that's a blood test or a liver test, or is it kind of better to use it as a precaution? As you said, it's kind of tough to give them too much in that sense.
I'm really promoting that we should be testing cows regularly, and it's maybe not for the vitamin A. I would not be giving injectable trace minerals or anything without testing cows, because you can't overdose them, right? You can't give them too much copper. You can kill cows with too much copper. So I would be much more cautious about that. Vitamin A, you could probably get away without testing before you just give it, and just to be safe. But if you didn't have to give it, why would you spend the money and the time and the effort to inject them with another product too, right? So it's not hard to test. Veterinarians can take some blood samples and ask for vitamin A and E. They can do some trace minerals on it. We can do liver biopsies. If you have a cow that dies for some reason or something, you can get a liver sample and send that in and see what their trace mineral panels are like. So there's a variety of ways of doing it.
Great, thank you. The next question is regarding iron in water, and so hopefully both of you can kind of speak on this one. So how important are high iron levels in water in regards to copper antagonism? Is there an acceptable limit for iron in water?
Do you know the answer to that, Jesse? I think I do.
No, I was just gonna say, John, please help me.
So iron can tie up copper. I don't think it's nearly as common as sulfates, but there are some areas with pretty high iron in their water, and it can tie up copper and some other minerals as well. I think the cut point is 300 parts per million. So if you get your water tested and it's over 300 parts per million, they suggest that above that it can start to have an impact on copper. So you may have to increase your copper if you can't change the water source. You may have to just increase your copper level. Another reason for testing cows, because you know, we just can't calculate all these interactions that we do get off our feed tests and water tests. We can't come up with an absolute answer of how much copper you need to feed. So the only way to do it is sort of tweak your mineral program and then test a few cows again and see where you're at.
Thanks, John. Our next question is chelated copper better to supplement when sulfates are an issue versus supplementing with inorganic copper?
Well, that's a tough question. It depends on the study. Some studies have shown a bit of a benefit. Other studies, we did one here recently where we gave some, Dr. Penner worked on that. You can listen to our podcast about that one, where he used high sulfate water to raise the sulfate levels, and it didn't seem like chelated copper made a big difference in that one. So it does depend on the study a little bit. There's been some studies where it seems to improve copper levels quicker, and so I guess I can't give you a solid answer on that one. And it might be difficult. It's certainly something we often try when we think we have high sulfates, but obviously it's a pretty expensive decision. So it's a good one to chat with your nutritionist and your veterinarian to see what they think. But the results have been kind of mixed.
Thanks. I have one more question and for Jesse, and then I think we're going to wrap up here. But could you give some advice regarding approaching grazing cropland and how you would, in terms of setting that up, as well as working with neighbors and trying to entice them into letting you graze your cows there?
Yeah. Well, first of all, BCRC has a wonderful calculator to calculate the cost, but I mean, to help you set a cost. I think it involves having really good relationship with your neighbors. There's tons of benefits, right? Especially if it's a year when, like this year, when we were on a provincial program, I guess, with our provincial insurance, where if you had a salvage crop and you allowed a producer to graze it, that crop producer actually gained more money. So things like that. But I feel like in the last few years around here, at least, people have really come around to it. It's extra income for the crop producer. You're going to be putting that manure and urine back on their field, so it's free fertilizer. Issues come, I guess, with fence. You might need to provide that fencing. Not all cropping guys have fence anymore, so you might need to invest in electric fence. Watering sources are often an issue when you're approaching crop guys, so you might have to have a movable watering system. But I think it just comes down to building those relationships. Like I said, talk to your neighbors, calculate a fair price, because it is, you know, they're not going to do something for free and you're both benefiting. So make sure you have a fair price. And I mean, try it out. I don't think we would have gotten through the last 4 years without grazing stubble or salvage crops. Do you have anything to add, I guess, John?
Nope, I think you got her covered.